Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Soul Focused Radio. This is your host, Martin Friedman, and I am very excited to introduce the continuation of our New Man series. And this is part two of Masculinity in American Prisons and Policing. In this episode that you're about to hear, I'm not going to keep you, I promise. I'm going to let you get right to it, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. The episode that you're about to hear is going to focus on the teen years. It sort of ended up being chronological. We go back and forth in time just a little bit, but what we really get into here is we get into what choices did Anwar and Devon feel like they had as they entered into their teen years. And then I add in too, and we talk a lot about whether you knew you had choices or not. Everybody has choices all the time. But as Soul Focus Group, we really focus on the power of knowing that you have choices. So that's really where a lot of the conversation starts. We talk about PTSD, and then we talk about emotions, range of emotions for men. And all of it is tied together with masculinity and violence and how that was experienced really by all three of us. So I'm happy you're here. We're always so happy to have you on board with what we do. So sit back, enjoy, and here we go.
As Devin was talking about when he said that it is almost magnified in those communities, especially those communities that are experiencing poverty and those resources aren't being provided or they're being pulled out. I also start to think about though how does media portray us too?
Really?
When I think about a lot of movies where predominantly or where majority of the cast is a cast of color, there's a lot of times that those movies have to do with violence. I mean, I'm thinking about Blood In, Blood Out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or Menace to Society, or any of those movies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we don't got Home Alone. We don't have those movies.
Yeah.
So it's like, wait a minute now. So I go back to what Martin just said a little bit ago when he said I just wasn't that kid. You know what? Neither was Devin, and neither were I. But we were made to be that kid.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
We were made to be that kid. I think about little kids when they're not violent. When they hit out of frustration. They hit out of something that may be painful, but they're not hitting because they want to be violent. So it's
mm-hmm.
that process of society that makes us to be what we were reflecting or we were projecting out into the world.
For sure.
So this is such an amazing conversation, right? This is such an amazing point because I felt like I had a choice. Like, you said neither of you were that kid too. Like when Dustin and my D and I have talked on these episodes too, we've talked about all three of us being extremely sensitive, right?
Right.
So if you all weren't that kid, did you feel like did you make a conscious choice to be that violent kid? I'm speaking more like in teen years, right? In teenage years. Did you feel like a switch turned on for you? Did you feel like you had a choice? Because I think feeling like you have a choice or don't feeling like you have a choice might really be the difference between being that kid or not being that kid.
And what you want to go first? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I had a choice. I mean, either I got my ass kicked in the streets or I got my ass kicked at home. One of the two.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's tough. I mean, I can tell you that, there were probably times that, I consciously was an asshole, that I consciously did something. But other times I was just functioning off from that place that, this is what I got to do. This is what I have to do overall.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I even think when we talk about, sensitivity from a very, very young age, whether it's in the home, in the community, or in media, it's these ideas like men don't cry, men don't show emotion. All of this stuff is taking place. So the conditioning is occurring before you even realize, where you could really want to try to express some emotion or feeling, but the idea of what it means to be a man has already taken shape before you really understand it. And then when you go into spaces where, like Anwar was saying, whether you're in the community or whether you're in home, like expressing any type of emotion, fear, an emotion in regards to, sadness or being hurt and expressing that somebody hurt your feelings. Like, people don't care about that. Like, the only thing that they care about is, how are you going to respond to it? And I think when that's what you're faced with and you're growing up, then quite naturally, yes, you want to be able to express and say, talk about love, talk about all of those things that are forbidden, but you can't. And so, like, when you know that you can't do something, you just move through it and show up the way that you're expected to. And then when you do that long enough, you begin to convince yourself that this is how you are and this is who you are. And then you create an entirely different persona. And I think that's the trick, is like, as a young person or as a teenager, you convince yourself that you're this person that you're really not. And then you begin to believe it. And as you move through that, you forget who you once truly were. And then the journey is like really trying to unpack all of those things you experienced and getting back to that person who has the space and capacity to express emotions other than anger or just happiness. And there's no in between. There's no spectrum.
Devon, what you're saying right now. So, at Soul Focus Group, we talk a lot about subconscious programming. We call it the groundwater
Mm-hmm.
that keeps everything in place. And it's all those external messages that then become internal messaging. Right. And so what you're talking about right now is your groundwater. Like, you essentially, what you're saying is really powerful, because I hear you saying you became essentially a new persona. Like, you weren't really, you're the true, like, Devon that you were as a little tiny kid before you started getting messed with or seeing this violence or having violence perpetuated on you, that you literally felt like you had to develop, or you did develop this persona based on, like, society's messaging about what it meant to be a man.
Right.
I know racial issues, all of that stuff. That's really what I'm hearing from you.
Right. Absolutely. And I think all of us are given that messaging. And if I'm not mistaken, I remember one of the things my D would tell me was, like, the difference between your authentic self and your ego. And the ego is what the world tells you who you are versus who you know yourself to be. And so I think, again, no matter what community that you're in, we're getting those messages from a very early age, and then your ego begins to be shaped and created. And so when you're in spaces where violence is prevalent, like, violence becomes a part of your ego. And so, like, when you're operating out of your ego, it's only natural to respond that way. Right. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I just, thinking about that, it's really easy to, I mean, we all know it. It's really easy to get caught up in that and believe, like, your ego is who you really are. And the truth of the matter, it isn't. So I said persona, but actually, like, when I'm thinking about it now, it's like really just operating an ego. Yeah.
That's it. And the ego's formed from that external messaging, right?
Right.
And it creates a false self. It's a false self that we believe is us, right? And, and again, I think I just want to ask again, like, did you feel like you had a choice? Because I know I had a choice, but that's the difference that I'm really feeling. Like, yeah, I got the same messaging, but I had a choice. I had a choice to not fight, to not be violent. My life and my manness was defined in the same way that yours was, both of you. Right. But I had choices that I'm not hearing that you all had.
No, yeah,
and that's the difference.
Yeah, to clearly answer that question, I would say, yeah, absolutely not. And especially when it comes to, like, what does it mean to be a Black man, right, in certain spaces, as a young guy. And this is the thing, is, like, I'm mixed. So my mom's white, my dad is Black, and my dad's not my dad, like I said, he left the picture in an early age, and my mom doesn't know how to raise me as a Black man. And so you begin to look at, like Anwar was saying, like, the messaging that you're getting in media, and then the people that you begin to associate yourself with in community, because there's a violence occurring in community, then it's only, like, we hear stuff, right? But what you see is reality a lot of the time. So someone could tell you something other than, like, don't act like this, but when you see people responding in certain ways and you're actually feeling the consequence of not acting out in a certain way, then again, you begin to say, like, well, this is really what it means to be a man. This is what it means. I gotta be out here. I gotta be tough. I can't show any weakness. I gotta be the first one to act out in violence because I don't want anybody to think I'm a sucker, or I'm soft or whatever it is. And so it's like you begin to do that. And then the reaction that you get also is reinforced. So when you do act out, and if you're acting like you want to be the guy, that's the most violent because that's what people respect, or that's, you don't want people to bother you. And so you almost like go overboard in certain instances to try to prove that you're a man, even in times when you're like a kid, literally, just so that you can mimic behaviors or convince yourself that you are worthy. And I think, I don't know. I don't have the experience of being a Latino man, but being in space with a lot of folks, even in those communities, it's like that's also, I feel like it's almost the exact same experience when it comes to what it means to be a man. Is violence is one of the prevalent identifiers of what it means to be a man in this world in America.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anwar, what are your thoughts about that? And like, how did that play out for you as a teenager specifically? Like, especially in the years like preceding to you joining the force?
I think at some point you talk about choice and you asked about choice and did I have a choice? Like I said, I think at times I felt like I had a choice and at times I felt like I just had to do what I had to do. And yeah, thinking about even in the education that I was a part of or the middle school that I was a part of or the high school, I would constantly see just really the ones that were getting into fights were students of color. The ones that were getting into fights were Black and brown students. And I would question this so much, like, man, what truly is going on? Why do we have to be at a space where we just, and I talked about this in the previous session, just this constant feeling of survival, this constant feeling of, oh, I got to protect myself. I got to protect my own. And it's almost, you ask about choice. I recall at a time when I was in middle school and then early on in my high school, where when you got on the bus, if you rode the bus with a certain group of students, you know what? There was no choice if you're going to back them up or not. It had to be done. If you took that seat, just know that you were going to ride in that seat until the end of that bus ride or the next day, and then until the end of high school. So in times like that, I felt like there were no choices. But leading up to my policing or me pursuing law enforcement, I pursued it with that passion of going into somewhere where I would want to help the community. Matter of fact, I vividly recall one of my teachers that knew, or that maybe they didn't know who I was as a kid. They just saw my behavior and they thought that's who I was. But when I became a police officer, I ran into a specific teacher, and they were shocked and they were surprised that I was a police officer. And it really made me think about, like, man, what are they really believing in me? What do they see in me for them to be this shocked? I was actually happy to see them, but their initial response was like being shocked. And even in law enforcement, that industry, and I call it an industry because that's what it is. That industry has its own meaning of what it is to be a man in such a male-driven role.
I was just going to ask you about that, like, because I think no matter what space you're in, it's there. Like, there's an expectation when you step into, whether it's the police force or whether it's on a football, like anywhere. Mm-hmm. There's kind of like these predefined roles of what it means to be a man in those spaces.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Could you talk more about that? Like, that would be like, I was just thinking, like, man, I wonder what that would be like in the police force or in law enforcement. How you expect it to show up.
What's crazy is in that space, when you're met with whether it's verbal or physical violence, the expectation again is to go to violence. Mm-hmm. And again, I say whether it's verbal or physical, because I remember plenty of times when it was just verbal, but we as officers felt like we had to take it to the physical component of it. Like, man up, let's just take care of this. Take care of what? Like, what? They're just talking shit.
Right.
Let them talk shit. But we felt the need to take it to that next space. And, again, it's such an industry that is driven by that mindset of this is how we have to take care of things. Yeah. And I mean, I recall even when we would have conversations around the table when we would have female officers and we would talk down or talk badly about those female officers because truly they weren't manly enough. Matter of fact, the officers that were almost looked up to that were female officers were those that were lesbian, that identified as lesbian.
Right. That would act act more masculine.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because you would hear officers say, they take care of things, or they take care of what they need to take care of.
Right.
Where on the other hand is almost we have to protect that female officer.
Right.
That does not identify as or that doesn't act manly, quote unquote.
Right.
So it was driven hard, not only through my youth years, but also through my years of becoming a police officer.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about this too, just the relationship between like law enforcement and community, and just thinking about what you were saying. Like if they're just talking, like someone is just talking crazy to an officer, there's still this expectation of violence. And then like how that plays itself out so many times, because I remember friends getting beat up by police for running away or whatever it may be. And just, how that, again, violence, like how that reinforces attitudes and behaviors towards one another. And like being in a position of power and authority, like you have the law behind you, there's no need to act violently. I mean, unless you're defending yourself or in those scenarios where it's really required. And yet it's still the expectation by your peers that, hey, if somebody talks to you like this, then beat them up, or, if somebody runs, beat them up, or we got to show that we are in charge here. And so what we're going to do is act out in violence, and just how that creates the tension in the relationships and actually, promotes, the perpetuation of it, of violence.
Mm-hmm.
Trip, man.
And I think about too, like often the number of hours that I was probably trained to de-escalate a situation are minimal in comparison to the amount of hours that I was taught on how to fight or how to defend myself. So really the question is, and how are you trained, or what training are you giving these officers to truly respond to those situations where they can truly verbally de-escalate? So that's why I said earlier when I started this podcast, I talked about, the person that you saw probably year 1 to 5 was a lot different than 5 to 10.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And it was because I was truly finally starting to find myself. I'm still trying to find myself, but I was starting to kind of come out of that mindset of accepting and really giving my individuality away through my job and through how I was socialized to view myself as an individual.
I think it's so interesting. Like, to me, it's so telling. Devon, I love your line of questioning, because what I'm really feeling is that, the violence that is happening on the street, the way we've made the decision is to be more violent. Like we will have our law enforcement be either the most violent or sort of like the final violent. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, you can be violent, but we're going to out-violent you.
Absolutely.
And that's how we're going to keep you from being violent, by being more violent from you. That's what I'm really feeling right now, which is really, when you think about it, you think about like, this is a patriarchal society. That is so typical of a patriarchal society, is that I'm going to dominate you to get you to stop doing what you're doing.
Physical dominance.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I just thinking about like that top down, it plays itself out. So like, man, that's what you're taught. That's how you control situations. And then it plays itself out. And like I said, when you have, it's something, and we've talked about this in the Undoing Racism, right? And so like when we take those communities, it's almost like those communities are in a prison, right? Because they don't have access. They can't move out of this situation. And so when folks are impoverished, or when they're dealing with what they're dealing with, and you're experiencing oppression through state violence, by that's police or laws or whatever it is, and then we wonder why folks end up turning on each other, or not turning on each other, but kind of exacting that same sort of violence on one another, right? Because that's essentially what you've been taught. Okay, if I'm stuck in here and I have to survive, now I have to do what it means to survive, which is violence, because that's what's being shown to me every day, all day, when I'm trying to access resources or get out of poverty and get out of and get the things that I need. And
Right.
so I think, again, from the very beginning, like that's what we're taught. That's the response, is violence. And then again, as a man, that's the expectation, is to know how to be violent. And like it's in those communities.
You know,
And I would say, like, too, like thinking about what you're talking about, Martin, like you had the choice. And that's the thing, is like you had law on your side, right?
right.
Mhm,
You had
mhm.
law enforcement that was going to show up and perpetuate that harm. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah,
That
absolutely. Oh, no. Check it out. I was totally raised with officer friendly. I mean,
Right.
I literally had to learn, doing the work that I did in Seattle, interacting with you all that were inside, and the people that you mentioned, like Mary and a whole other bunch of folks. I mean, I literally had to learn over time that the sound of a siren was not soothing to everybody.
Mhm.
Like the sound of a siren wasn't, oh, everything's gonna be all right now. Like that was a socialization process that absolutely shifted for me. Because when I was a kid, like I knew who the good guys were, I knew who the bad guys were. Now sometimes I was a bad guy, sometimes,
Yeah.
and I would sometimes hang out with the bad guys. However, and I'm doing air quotes. So anybody out there that thinks I'm actually talking about good guys and bad guys, I'm air quoting like
Right.
crazy, right? So I don't believe in it, right? But I'm just saying this was my socialization.
Right.
And I think it's such a good question, Devon, because I mean, I was going like 15, 16 years old. I was going into the hood. I was sharing weed with people on the corner, and they were going and buying me like Mad Dog and, like fortified wine. For those of you know what I'm saying, like I was literally living that life, like taking those risks. And yet I always knew in the back of my mind, if anything ever went really bad,
Mm.
I had to stay on my side.
Yeah.
Like I knew if anything ever went really bad, and I was in some situations, but I know they weren't thinking about calling the police.
Right.
I always knew I could,
Right.
even though I had brought it on myself. That I think is we always talked about the context, right? That you can do the same thing. And what racism and classism and all that stuff really is really context, because you can do the same thing. And if your life is contextualized one way, you'll have these choices, these results, these opportunities, these accesses. And if your life is contextualized another way, by race, by class, etc., you'll have a whole different context of choices, opportunities, and access. And that's ultimately what racism is, what it breaks down to.
Right.
Is context, choices, what access do you have? What choices do you have?
Right.
That's ultimately what it is.
For sure. For sure.
So, Devon, you brought up what we talked about, and what is probably still talked about with a lot of anti-racist training organizations around like developing that community and showing how that community is kind of cut off. Now at Soul Focus Group, we're taking it one step further, because we're saying, yes, absolutely. Like these communities are isolated, they're controlled by police in ways that are very different than suburbs, et cetera, poor communities, and especially, poor communities of color, 100%, right? And we're also saying that the real entrapment, the real prison, is our subconscious mind. And it's the external messages that become internal messages. And I'm wondering, like, the question that's on my mind listening to you both talk is, like, as your socialization develops in your teens, and as you get closer to adulthood, and as you both get closer to this incredibly monumental year of 20 years old in your life, because you both are about to come up on this incredibly monumental, life-changing year, right? What is going on for you in terms of emotionally? Like, what emotions are you able to access? What emotions are you not able to access? What are you feeling like your emotional maturity is? What's happening for you all emotionally as you're coming up on your 20th year?
When I was 20, emotionally, I was a wreck, right? I mean, one of the things now when I look back is dealing with PTSD, dealing with anxiety and depression, and not really being able to name it and know what that is, and thinking I'm crazy, like thinking there's really something wrong with me. And the only thing I know how to do is get high or drink in order to medicate. Right. So emotionally, I didn't know what I was feeling. I just knew that I didn't like it. And the one thing that I knew I could do was consume a substance to make that go away, to numb it out. It wasn't like I didn't drink to get happy. I didn't drink to get angry. I drank so that I didn't have to feel what I was feeling. And unfortunately, like it would just magnify whatever was going on for me. And so like at that stage at 20, like I felt like I had two emotions, and it was happy or extremely angry, because I couldn't tell you I was sad or I was depressed or I was lonely or I was any of these emotions that a person feels, confused, insecure, all of those things when you don't have good self-esteem, not really being able to name it, just knowing that it didn't feel good and I wanted it to go away. And so I think that was something that when you can't name things and you can't communicate, then it weighs on how you feel about yourself, and that ultimately impacts the way that I would show up in the world, and I would be angry and violent, because like if I'm angry, I know that for every problem that I had was a nail, and the only tool I had was a hammer, and every problem was a nail, then that was the tool I was using. Yeah, so I think, man, when I think about that and I look back at myself at that young age, it's like, man, it's not a shocker that these were the ways that I responded. And so I think as I began to grow and understand that, I wasn't so harsh on myself for showing up the way I did. It's unfortunate that people were harmed. Like I really do regret that there were people harmed because I didn't know how to show up the right way, because I was emotionally, like my emotional intelligence was really low. I mean, when you asked, like where we were at, I feel like I was at a 5-year-old, man. You know what I'm saying? Like I was a kid, I was a baby, right? It was literally grown up temper tantrums. Except I had access, I was older and had access to weapons, and would actually was big enough to, when I hit someone or when I was in a fight and got into an altercation, there was like serious harm involved. Yeah. So yeah, that's a really great question.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was, man, that's a good one.
Yeah, man, I'm not laughing because what you said is funny, but I'm like, it's like when you said that it was like being a grown-up 5-year-old, like there was a whole range of emotions that you were not accessing.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
based on our conversation to this point, so much of that was about what it meant to be a man living that street life like you were living, right?
Yeah.
Like you couldn't go up to your friend and be like, bro, I woke up depressed today. Like I'm feeling like I'm just sad. I'm sad that I don't have this or that. That's just, that was never a conversation that you felt that you had the ability to access.
What's even, I would say what's sad is that most people in those spaces were feeling the same thing.
Right.
And we just didn't know how to talk to each other about it. And then it's like out of fear of being judged, like if I do open up and tell this person this, what's the response? And at the same time, that person is still going through the same range of emotions. They just don't know how to articulate it, or they have the same fear of doing it. And so it's like you have a lot of people that are running around feeling the same thing, but are unable to talk about it because of the fear of the consequence.
Right.
And then like another question, like I have this for Anwar, is at 20, I think stepping into law enforcement, I think again, like there's an expectation of like what range of emotions are acceptable in the police force. Like you can't go talk to your coworker and say I'm depressed, or I'm feeling sad about the way this situation played out when we went to respond to this call. You know what I'm saying?
Well, now I want to know the same thing from you. Yeah, I want to know the same thing from you, Anwar, like leading up to that, like in your teenage years, 14, 15, 16, 17, leading up to that. What was it like for you?
Devon, thank you for bringing that up, bro, because yeah, it's true. I mean, I went from a place where, again, I was on survival mode. I was on this mode of, one, I can't talk about these emotions. Instead, I have to act on those emotions. I have to act on whatever anger I may be feeling in a negative way, unfortunately.
Yeah.
To then move on to really without much time for growth in my life. Again, I went in at a young age. I mean, very mature. At 20, 21, I didn't know anything. I mean, I knew about life, but it was life that had to do with me. And yeah, I had experienced a lot of stuff, but then to add on, to continue that trauma with more trauma, I mean, that's just a recipe for disaster at some point in my life.
Absolutely.
So I
Absolutely.
never truly had time to metabolize and to go through healing for my own stuff, to then quickly just slide into and step into something that, again, I never realized or I never thought was just going to create more internal damage,
Mm.
and just continue to break at the core and break at that spirit that I can tell you as a baby, I was probably most likely, highly likely that I was born with this beautiful spirit that and energy that just started to deteriorate little by little throughout that time. And then now I'm having to find again.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Crazy.
So would you also say like did you have a similar experience with Devon in terms of like, he gave us an emotional age. He said he was like an emotional 5-year-old. Like what would you say your emotional age was in those teenage years leading up to this monumental age of 20?
I would probably say right around there. Yeah, I would probably say right around there. I mean, thinking about the decisions that I had made, thinking about how I behaved and how I treated relationships, not only with friends, but also with other women and
Mm.
my parents and acquaintances. Yeah, it was probably that age. It was no more than 10 years old.
Mm.
And I think, what's interesting is like those are the ages where we get cut off from emoting, right? Like when
Mm-hmm.
you're conditioning and when you're a little kid and they tell you don't cry, like big boys don't cry, big boys don't do this. I think again, it's not a shock that those are some of the similarities.
Absolutely. And going to your earlier question to me in terms of like, even though my economic reality and my, cultural and ethnic and racial realities were different from you all, I just want to say for the record, when I'm 20, which is, getting to the point where by the way, I hadn't even graduated high school yet. It took me 2 extra years to graduate high school. So I was very emotionally immature, like extremely. It wasn't playing out in the same way. I'm also I want to be clear. Most of my reaction, my whole life has been an angry reaction. I
Mm,
just didn't have to fight about it,
right.
anger has almost always been my default my whole life. So I'll just add in that I was definitely emotionally immature in many ways. When I went off to college, when I moved, all the way across the country to Olympia, Washington to go to Evergreen State College when I was 21, getting ready to turn 22, I was such a child. And I remember getting like really high and really drunk and just like essentially acting like, telling my friends, like basically I'm like a child
Right.
and, getting really high, like having bad trips on ecstasy and things like that and just crying and just basically telling people I'm like a child. That's how I felt. It just
Right.
played out differently. I didn't go into the areas that you all went into. I didn't get into the, street life and I didn't get into, the militaristic paramilitary organization like the police.
Right.
But, it was just my own version of the same thing. It
Right.
was just my own version of the same thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think, it's something that I think is one of the things that it means as we transition out of those teenage years into our 20s, that for many of us as men, and I won't speak for women, they might have similar experiences, but for many of us as men, if not all of us, we have been either encouraged or forced or allowed to be emotionally immature.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I think most men in this country, or I think in general, have been taught that, emotions are for women to experience and not men.
Mhm.
Like, you got to be tough. It's a dog eat dog world. So, look out for yourself, take care of your family, suck it up, don't cry, and fight through it. Right. And actually, depression is a weakness, anxiety is a weakness, having low
Mhm.
self esteem is a weakness. And so, people, no matter whether they're feeling them or not, they have to put on the facade or the front that everything is okay and that they are going to tough it out. And eventually, I think that's why so many people are like, we go through those really, really crushing phases where we're trying to figure out a way through without tapping into your emotion, which is it's impossible. And so it's not a shocker that people are turn to substances or they turn to things that kind of take them away from the feelings that they're experiencing.
Yeah. And all of it still, like we've been talking about, it all ties back into our groundwater and how we were socialized to be a man.
Yeah.
Wow. Just finished listening back to this episode, and it was a very powerful episode. And as I said at the beginning, we covered a wide range, really focusing mostly on the teenage years. So you got to hear us talk about our different experiences and the way violence and masculinity kind of intertwine for each of us. And I thought one of the most powerful things that really stuck with me was the conversation about emotional maturity and range of emotions, which is definitely something that is limited for many of us as we're acculturated as men in this society. The range of emotions that's offered to us, gets smaller and smaller the older that we get. And that is programming, that is groundwater, that is socialization. And we are here at Soul Focus Group to tell you that all of us can re-engineer our groundwater. We do not have to stay stuck in places that we don't want to be. And all of this, as we said, is about creating, about moving from a place where you feel like you have to fight all the time in your life to a place where you start to really feel like you have the opportunity to create. And that is the journey that all of us are on. We're excited that you're on this journey with us. We know that we love you. We love you very much. And we're just so happy to have you a part of what we do. As always, we ask you to check out soulfocusgroup.com. See everything that we're doing. Many new offerings will be coming down the pike very soon. So come and check us out and listen to our podcast. We are getting close to 100 podcasts now. So there's a lot to listen to. If you're just finding us, you can binge us. There's a lot of binge-worthy content. Look for us on all of your favorite podcast platforms. So with that, we ask each and every one of you to stay safe, stay well, and most of all, stay soul focused.